numbers. Houston does have a large homeless population, but when you look across the nation, we've done a lot of work about reducing our homeless population. And since 2011, we've gone down in our homeless population by over 54%. It's incredible. Cities all over the country look to us to figure out how we do it. And I get pop-up emails all the time from other cities who are looking to make the impact that we did in Houston. And the first thing I always say is, we house people. How do you end homelessness? It's through housing. And in Houston, it's not just through temporary and shelter housing, it's really through permanent housing, giving people permanent solutions, not just single night solutions, but long-term solutions where they can get back on their feet and stay supported over time. Housing makes a ton of sense, literally cents, like dollars and cents. The numbers are a little tricky, but on average, to house a person in our system, it's about $17,000 a year. And that includes the rent and the wraparound services, compared to what having someone on the street can cost in the upwards of $75,000 a year, between using different medical services, the jail systems, or just, other kind of wraparound quick street services. So it makes sense, right, in a dollar and cents way. But still, it's very challenging to do this work, and there's lots of different housing options available. But the bottom line is that permanent housing is the solution to ending homelessness. If we really want to end homelessness, this is the way to do it. It's through permanent housing. It's not through shelter beds. It's not through transitional housing. It's through permanent housing. And Houston has done a really great job at investing in our permanent housing solutions so that we're ending the problem, not just at a point in time, but for the future. So I'm going to turn it over to Phoebe.
Hello, can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. I want to apologize ahead of time. I'm inflicted by the cedar pollen that is in the air all across Texas right now. So my apologies if I sound a little bit scratchy. So yeah, Tal and Alexis both alluded to this. I wanted to show you all some images because, as you can imagine, housing for homeless people can really cross the spectrum, right? So before I started in working in homeless services over 10 years ago, this was the image that usually came to my mind when I thought of housing for folks who are homeless, right? So it's emergency shelter. Some people call it 3 hots and a cot, right? 3 hot meals, a place to lay your head at night. And this was, the predominant housing intervention for homeless people for decades, for many, many years. Next slide. So you may also think of this, right? So this is transitional housing. So, this could be a program where someone who's homeless enters, stays for a few months, a year, maybe up to 2 years, goes through some classes, maybe works on getting a job, and then graduates to their own housing. Right. So transitional housing also plays a part kind of in the spectrum, but is not necessarily permanent. Next slide. So this, take a look at it. These could be apartments that you have rented or you have stayed at, that I may have stayed at, right? That folks who have been homeless and who have not been homeless could have stayed at. So this is really, represents permanent housing. And as Alexis mentioned, so much of our shift over the years has been toward permanent housing solutions. Next slide. So you'll see, this is a whole spectrum of different kinds of housing. And so when you think about Search's housing programs, we completely consist of permanent housing solutions. There are some differences within those programs, and there are other agencies that do more of the shelter placement, transitional housing, but Search believes so much in investing in permanent housing that is what we talk about, when we refer to our housing programs. And just as a caveat, right, Search does not own or operate our own housing. We provide the supportive services, and we partner with property owners and property managers who provide the housing. So I will shift it to my colleague Kelly, who will share a little bit more.
Thanks, Phoebe. So during the 90s, there was this paradigm shift where it started to become clear that this staircase approach that you can kind of visualize here, notably for folks with like mental health disorders or substance use disorders, it wasn't working effectively, right? So they found that, clients would get stuck in one of these stair steps and couldn't always complete tasks necessary in one of these types of programs in order to move forward to the next level. Or they were being evicted from these programs for strict rules, like total abstinence from drugs and alcohol, or being required to participate in psychiatric treatment. So there were worries about whether this approach was setting unattainable standards, like essentially kind of being like, you're required to be a perfect citizen rather than an ordinary citizen. Because you think about, right, when you get your own housing, it's like you didn't have to go through all these and jump through all these hoops in order to get your own housing, right? So essentially people were just kind of cycling back into homelessness and feeling very dejected by the process if they, weren't able to kind of, succeed in one of these programs here. So what emerged from these discoveries was this idea of, hey, what if we just skip all of these steps, get them straight into housing, and then they have a more comfortable place to focus on these other goals if they so choose. And from that emerged the concept of housing first. So it flips that principle of someone needing to be housing ready completely upside down and says, no, they don't need to be housing ready, but rather housing programs and service providers need to be consumer ready. We need to be ready to provide quality, customized services to our clients because that's what they're deserving of. So this model is based on the notion that adequate housing should be a fundamental human right, not something you have to prove yourself worthy of, not something that is predicated on how much money is in your wallet. You as a human being are deserving of safe and affordable housing, and we as a supportive services team are going to tailor our approach to work with you to address your housing and healthcare needs so that you can maintain it for as long as it's needed. Bottom line. Next slide. So these are some of the core principles of the housing first approach. I'm not going to get too in depth in each one for the sake of time, but right, we touched on that. Housing is a human right. Choice and control for service users. So our clients' voices should be heard and they should be involved in the decision-making process around their care, and really focusing on the individual strengths and needs of our clients. Harm reduction, right? So we're not, as I mentioned, when we're talking about these previous, model or these other models of like transitional housing, where there may be kind of stricter rules around, abstinence and things of that nature, right? I mean, we're kind of looking at how can we help you to either use in a way that's more safe, that's not putting your housing in jeopardy, or, if it's an issue in terms of like paying rent, how can we ensure that your rent's getting paid first? And then you can use, kind of the rest on whatever, you need to do with it. Active engagement without coercion. So it's our role and responsibility to make sure that our services are enticing to our clients. So just like if you're going into a store, right, and someone's, the sales associate wants to sell you on a product or service, they can't force you to take that, right? But they can sure share with you the benefits of purchasing this product or taking this service, right? And that's very similar in kind of our approach as well, is they're not required to, participate in our services. They can choose to do so as little or as much as they like, but we can definitely kind of share with them how it would be a benefit to participate in our services. And separation of housing and treatment. So engaging with services or treatment is not a requirement for maintaining housing. Now, abiding by the house rules and the stipulations of your lease agreement is, but you don't have to, once again, like meet X number of times if that's not, required by your program. And a person-centered planning, or as we say here at Search, a client-centered approach. So we take a more collaborative approach in working with our clients. And once again, that goes back to that idea of, their voices being heard and included in that process. And recovery orientation, focusing on the overall well-being of the individual at all levels to regain a more meaningful life. So this is not just about recovery from substance abuse, but being able to provide the supports needed to create a life that integrates them into a community in a positive way. And flexible support for as long as required. So services are not time limited. Once again, they can be in our program for, as long as they need our services and as long as they abide by the stipulations of their lease agreement, or until they're ready to graduate from the program and step on without the use of case management services. So that is Housing First in a nutshell, and I am going to pass it back to Phoebe.
So practically speaking, how do homeless people access this amazing permanent housing, that we're talking about? And then if there's not enough permanent housing available, which there is not necessarily, so this is not a hypothetical question. It's one, our community wrestles with every day. But, how do we prioritize who gets it first? Next slide. So you'll see a couple of diagrams here. On the left-hand side, this triangle, this represents how things used to be. So, over 10 years ago when I started in this field, if I met somebody on the street who needed permanent housing, I would call the person who worked for, the 1 or 2 permanent housing programs we had at Search back then, and see if they had an opening. If so, they would sit down with the person and gauge, is this person a good fit? More often than not, we had many less slots available than we had people who needed it. And sometimes we deemed the person not a good fit. So then I would send this person down the street, maybe to the next homeless service agency, and they would go through that process all over again. And, if you can imagine being on the streets, not having a car, walking around to these different organizations, trying to get the help you need, being asked all these different questions by different agencies, not really knowing where to start. You can see how it becomes a maze, right? Like this in this diagram. And it was like this pretty much across the nation if somebody was homeless. It was very confusing. It was not coordinated. And so the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, so they, since the 80s, they've been dispersing funds, federal funds for homeless assistance and homeless programs throughout the nation. So HUD decided to step in, right? And about 8 to 10 years ago, they required any community that was receiving these funds to come up with what's called a coordinated entry system to really streamline and standardize the way that homeless people get connected to permanent housing. And so our community here in Houston, back in 2014, we implemented a system which we call coordinated access, and it's overseen and run by our local coalition for the homeless. And so, now if you're homeless on the street needing permanent housing, the system looks a lot more like this diagram on the right, where there's specific access points where you can meet with somebody and, be assessed for all of the potential permanent housing programs for homeless people here in Houston. And then you can receive assistance, being able to kind of navigate the system and get into housing and then get placed into housing. And so, with the system, there is the reality that, again, there is often not enough housing slots available than there is a need. And so then how do people get prioritized? So in the old system with this maze, right, it's kind of like whoever could find their way to the nearest housing program and happen to get that slot. It's kind of like first come, first serve. Or in some ways, it's the people on the streets who were the savviest, who had less, who were functioning more, who had less barriers that could access the housing. So this is a major difference and major shift where in our new system, the coordinated access system, it's really, people are prioritized for housing based on their need, right? So the person who is more vulnerable has maybe more health conditions or more kind of historical barriers that really makes them vulnerable on the street. They're the ones who get prioritized first for housing. And this really is in line with that housing first shift that Kelly was sharing with us about. So I will pass it back to Alexis.
Sure. So when people are assessed for coordinated access, they're given one of 2 housing solutions, or basically in Houston, we either have rapid rehousing or we have permanent supportive housing. And we call those programs, we use some acronyms, RRH for rapid and PSH for permanent. But everybody who gets assessed for housing through a coordinated access system fits into one of those 2 housing solutions. Now, where they fall in that prioritization is going to vary quite a bit. But the 2 housing interventions themselves are very different. They're different solutions for different people in different types of in different types of situations, right? So permanent supportive housing is a really intensive housing model. And it's for people who've experienced homelessness for long periods of time and also have chronic disabling conditions. And so there's a lot of work that goes into defining exactly what that means, but it really is targeted for people who have the most severe situations and have the highest service need. And that makes sense, right? Because it's a permanent housing solution that has a permanent subsidy attached to it. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But basically, these people are going to get long-term help for years, as long as they maintain their work in the program and they continue their eligibility. And on average, most people contribute about 30% of their income towards their rent, and we pay the rest, or the system pays the rest, or the housing provider pays the rest. And so you can see that that's a really kind of intensive service. It comes with the housing solutions, it comes with case management, and it's indefinite. On rapid rehousing, it's really for a different type of person or a different type of family. It's time limited. On average, a rapid rehousing program goes 6 months to 12 months. Sometimes it'll even stretch into 18, but ideally it's quite short. And it's targeted to individuals and families that have a more moderate need. And so in our system in Houston, we rank people in order. The prioritization now goes from chronic all the way down. And there's an actual threshold and cutoff point in the scoring systems that designates where that rapid rehousing threshold falls. And so it's quite lower, right? It's people that do not necessarily have the disabling condition or haven't experienced homelessness for as long. The way I like to think about it is it's people that kind of their backgrounds, their histories and situations indicate that they will be able to get back up on their feet financially in 6 months to 12 months, right? With like a little bit of support. And so rapid rehousing programs, they add, it's a financial support system and a case management support system that's time limited, where the financial comes in the form of rent. And rapid rehousing programs all look different. In Houston, we have a couple different variations, but it's usually that a client pays some percentage of their income over time, or they pay a percentage of the rent and it slowly ticks up. And the idea is that that's helping someone slowly increase and get back to the point where they own 100% of their rent. So for instance, for the first 3 months, they might not pay anything. By the 4th month, they might pay 10% of the rent, the next month, 20%, 30%, that kind of thing. Another version could be that they start by paying 20% of their income, 30% of their income, that kind of thing, and they work up to it where it's affordable and reasonable. And with Rapid, we're also providing case management support. A lot of it is very financially based. It's budgetary. We're trying to help people focus on being able to retain that rent and stay in their unit when our program ends. So people sign leases, but our program ends and hopefully they stay in that unit and they take over the lease and the rent themselves. In Houston, there are both of these. Search has both programs. We have both permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. The amount of it available in the community really depends on the amount of resource coming in and what those dollars are flagged for. So right now in Houston, because of all of the COVID dollars coming in, there has been a huge influx of rapid rehousing availability, thousands of units with more intended. And they are open to singles and to families, just like permanent supportive housing is.
All right. Well, as Alexis mentioned, we're working with folks who are chronically homeless. So in other words, folks who have been homeless for at least a year or more and have some sort of documented disability, either a physical disability or a mental health disability. And when you think about folks who have been homeless for a long time, you can imagine the stress, trauma that comes along with that. And inevitably, that's going to take a toll on your mind and body. And so they typically have complex and long-term health conditions, which are only going to worsen if they continue to stay on the streets and thus shorten their lifespan. And the gentleman in the picture on the right, Mr. William, he was a client of one of our permanent supportive housing projects and has since graduated from the program and is living in a very nice independent senior living apartment. But before he was housed in our program, he told his case manager that he was at risk of losing one of his legs. And he potentially could have had he stayed on the street any longer. And he said to me that he truly believed he was going to die on the streets had he not been given the opportunity for housing. And by being housed, him and his case manager were able to get him connected with a primary care physician and ensure that he made it to his health care appointments. So there's a disability piece of homelessness that can be a barrier, but also just the sheer fact that many of our clients have been homeless for so long that some of them have never even had their own apartment or signed their own lease. You know, we housed somebody, I mean, they were in their 50s and they were so excited to like get the key to their own apartment. So you can imagine that, you know, if you've gone this long without ever having your own place, you know, you're not in the habit of paying rent or utilities or keeping a whole apartment clean or dealing with neighbors you don't like. So oftentimes our clients need support in those areas, and that's where our case managers can be, you know, beneficial in terms of helping them with developing those life skills. I think another thing too is criminal background, right? You know, we're working with folks who have extensive criminal backgrounds, and not only does that make it particularly challenging for folks to find housing, but also we've seen folks, you know, who've been incarcerated for a very long time. You know, they're having difficulties with digital literacy and using new technology. So we worked with a client who was in prison for 30 years. They were arrested back when they were 16 years old. Back in the late 80s and then released in the 2000s. And I mean, think about that technological shift that occurred over that time frame. You know, they're coming out and like completely like lost of like what's happening, not knowing how to access, you know, an email account and do all these things. And that really definitely, you know, that's challenging, especially when, you know, you have folks, you know, organizations moving to more, you know, technological ways of handling things like applications and information and referral and all of that. So that's definitely another piece where our case managers have been really instrumental in helping to improve digital literacy and just kind of those other basic life skills that folks need in order to be successful without the use of case management. All right, I think we're going to Phoebe next.
So yeah, just to summarize briefly some of what you've heard, you can think of, you know, the major components that make permanent housing programs work, you know, both rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing as a three-legged stool. So you'll see, you know, on the left-hand side, we need actual physical housing units, right? A lot of times that's an apartment unit. Sometimes it could be a duplex, a townhouse, you know, a single family home, just depending on the household size. So we need the unit, we need, you know, property owner or manager who is willing to work with our clients. And then in the middle, it's supportive services, right? And that is Search's sweet spot. That is our specialty in what we provide, because we don't just place people in housing and say, goodbye, hope you make it, right? But we know that our services, as Kelly described, really is a key component to helping people maintain permanent housing. And then on the right-hand side is the rental subsidy. So Alexis was talking about this earlier, right? For it to be affordable housing, you know, that financial assistance or subsidy for somebody's rent needs to be there. So there are certain ways to kind of calculate it, both in rapid rehousing and PSH, that really helps ensure that the amount that a resident or a client is responsible for is affordable. So, you know, Search, we own that third leg, right? Again, that is really where we step in. But we also do a lot of work and a lot of partnership building to ensure that the other legs are stable, right? So we develop and maintain partnerships with, you know, property owners and managers. And we also, you know, develop and maintain relationships with funders and with subsidy providers like the Houston Housing Authority or Harris County Housing Authority to secure vouchers to allow our clients to live in affordable housing. And back to Kelly.
All right. And so, you know, thinking about the outcomes that we seek to achieve with permanent supportive housing, of course, the, you know, biggest one, right, is maintaining housing and stability. And that goes back to a lot of the life skills that I discussed of, you know, making sure that, you know, clients are paying rent and keeping their room clean as they have annual housing inspections, making sure that they're putting in requests for repairs, as well as also thinking about kind of the behavioral issues that can sometimes arise, you know, with folks who are exhibiting some of mental health disorders or substance use disorders. So these behavioral concerns or these like interpersonal interactions between neighbors that don't get along and things of that nature, and helping them kind of developing those life skills in order to be able to maintain their housing. As well as increasing income and financial stability. So because a lot of our folks have some sort of physical or mental health disability, we have some folks who are already coming in with some type of Social Security benefits or disability benefits, but not all folks do. So we may, as a case manager, assist with either helping them to apply for disability benefits if they're, well connected with a mental health care provider or a primary care physician and believe they have a strong case, or getting connected with a disability specialist who can assist with that process as well. And for folks who maybe don't necessarily have a strong, case for disability, mostly because they may not be connected to treatment or haven't been going to their appointments very regularly, which is common because once again, going to treatment is not a requirement of staying housed in a permanent supportive housing program. So we may assist those folks with getting income another way. So maybe that's making a referral to an employment agency and helping them, seek employment and earn income that way. And then improving health and quality of life. So once again, going back to that idea of, how can we create or help you to create a life that's meaningful for you? What does that look like for you? And how can we get you there? What supports can we put in place? So not just kind of the, addressing the literal physical and mental health aspect of it, of going to your appointment, seeing your doctor and all of that, but just, the quality of life piece of like, what makes you happy and what do you see for your life? And being able to kind of rewrite that narrative, if you will. So just to keep us on time, I'm going to stop there. I know we kind of gave y'all the spark notes of housing first, so I will pause there if anybody has questions.
So one thing just to chime in, this slide does say what outcomes PSH hopes to achieve, but this is also true for Rapid. These are the same goals and the same outcomes that we're trying to achieve in Rapid Rehousing as well. But one of the key markers of Rapid is